Hello, I'm Kent Myers.
I'm Mick Cornett, and it's time for The Verdict.
As a part of its traditional and continuing commitment to public and community service, Crowe and Dunleavy Law Firm presents The Verdict, an objective discussion of contemporary legal issues hosted by Kent Myers. And also brought to you by a friend of Oklahoma Lawyers for Children and Delta Dental Plan of Oklahoma. And welcome to The Verdict. I'm Mick Cornett. This week's show deals with the issue of presidential pardons. Let me once again introduce one of Oklahoma's top legal experts and my co-host, Kent Myers. Boy, Kent, you couldn't have picked a better time to come up with this topic.
Well, it's a firestorm. Yeah. It's an absolute firestorm. President Clinton just never seemed to do a dull thing while he was president, and he left with a bang. He left pardoning 141 people of various crimes and offenses on the last day of his presidency without any prior checking with anyone and without any notice that it was going to happen. And members of his own party have called it anything from shameful to something that ought to cause him to be impeached again after he's left office. Well, we have two people today that will tell us a lot about what pardons are and whether there are any problems with what he did.
You know, our Constitution seems to be based on checks and balances, but here to the executive branch is given an almost unlimited power in this regard of pardons.
Well, it seems to be almost unlimited, and there'll be some that would say you can strike the word almost. It is unlimited. Whether or not all we have a right to do is be mad about it or be angry if one chooses to be, it will remain to be seen by listening to these good constitutional scholars that we have.
Well, I look forward to it. It's Presidential Pardons. The show is The Verdict, and we'll be right back.
See the most endearing comedy in the world of classical ballet when Ballet Oklahoma presents Coppelia, May the 4th, 5th, and 6th at the Kirkpatrick Auditorium. Hi, this is Brian Pitts. Join Ballet Oklahoma for the enchanting story of a doll maker who almost succeeds in bringing his dreams to life. The plot turns to comedy when Franz mistakes a doll for a real girl and falls in love, and Swanhilda hatches a plan to put an end to this nonsense. Coppelia is fresh entertainment the whole family will enjoy. Don't miss a moment of the magic. Call 848-TOES for tickets today.
All children deserve a life of hope and love, but sometimes they experience a life of pain, neglect, and abuse.
When that happens, each child deserves all of the quality assistance and representation that can be offered in our legal system. Oklahoma Lawyers for Children has over 350 of the best attorneys and volunteers in Oklahoma County who donate their time and services to represent children. For more information, call 405-23-CHILD.
Oklahoma Lawyers for Children, helping to bring hope and love back to the lives of abused children.
And welcome back to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers. We're ready to discuss the issue of presidential pardons. Kent, why don't you introduce our guests?
Well, we're pleased, Mick, to have two really good, well-recognized experts on presidential pardons. And the nice thing about it is they're both here from Oklahoma. On my right is Professor Art LeFrancois from the Oklahoma City University, a constitutional law expert, a person that has written extensively in the area of constitutional law and criminal law, some of which might be involved in what we talk about today. And Professor LeFrancois has also practiced privately before he became a law teacher. Art, we're really glad to have you.
Thank you, Ken.
On my left is Michael Scaperlanda, a professor, a constitutional law scholar at the University of Oklahoma College of Law, and his resume sounds a lot like Art's because they're both outstanding. He has written extensively in this field. He has practiced privately, and these two gentlemen know as much about the subject as anybody we could find, and we're just thrilled to have them. Thank Mike's glad that you're here. Now let's get started with Art. Art, tell us what a pardon is. We know generally it means to excuse, but tell us how you would define a pardon.
Well, Kent, the general area that we'll be talking about today is, I think, the area of executive clemency, and there are three things that I think will be relevant to our discussion. The first is, and the best known, is the idea of a pardon. A pardon is really an exemption from punishment. We might talk a bit as well about commutations and reprieves. A commutation is simply a reduction in punishment, and a reprieve is a postponement of punishment.
Well, Michael, what's the source of the president's power to pardon?
Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution.
Well, we have a graphic on that, I think. Go ahead.
Yeah, Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution says that the president shall have the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment.
Now, except in cases of impeachment, does that mean that President Clinton could not have pardoned himself when he was about to be impeached?
That's exactly right.
That raises a question that I want to ask Art. Can a president pardon himself for any crime?
Well, I think the Nixon administration thought seriously about the possibility of a self-pardon, Kent. I don't think there's a clear answer to the question. From a policy perspective, there would be fairly clear and I think quite strong arguments against the notion of a self-pardon, but it's not something, to my knowledge, that's been litigated conclusively.
There's nothing in Article 2, Section 2 that would, on its face, prohibit it.
That's correct.
Michael, what's the history of pardoning power? How did our Constitution come to include that power?
It really goes back thousands of years, and heads of state, whoever's in power, has exercised the pardon power throughout history. One reason is to promote justice when the justice system fails, or when somebody has proven their worth over time, that they've been rehabilitated. The pardon power can be used to clear their name. But it's also served throughout history another purpose, and that is to endear the authority, the leaders, to the people, to create tranquility, to heal wounds that have developed.
How would that happen?
Well, for instance, and this is interesting that this discussion's occurring in the Easter season. Pontius Pilate, when he wanted to release Jesus, asked the people if he could pardon Jesus. And the people said no, they wanted Barabbas. And so he ended up releasing Barabbas as a way to sort of quell the crowds. So that's how it could happen. It's happened throughout our history. Healing the nation, President Ford's very controversial pardon of President Nixon was an effort to heal the nation. President Lincoln did the same thing. And President Johnson in healing the nation by creating amnesty for former Confederate soldiers. So it's been used throughout history for those purposes.
Art, our first president, George Washington, used it in some respect to do with something called the Whiskey Rebellion. What was that all about?
He did. Well, he pardoned a number of people involved in the Whiskey Rebellion, and the idea, I think, behind those pardons was that this would be a way of healing the country after a fairly serious schism. And this is something that I think was anticipated by the framers, that it might be important for an executive quite quickly to issue a pardon so that both sides could heal wounds and come together. And I think, along with the other illustrations, that's a good example of that use of the pardon power.
Now, typically a pardon, as granted by the president, goes through some hoops before the president grants it. Some other people look at it. Is that right, Michael?
That's right. There's an office in the Department of Justice, the Office of Pardon Attorney, and this office was created, I believe, in 1898, and has been used fairly extensively as sort of a vetting process where people that are interested in receiving a pardon apply, and there's a procedure they go through.
So there's an established procedure that wasn't followed by President Clinton.
That's right.
And there were, and there were other pardons granted by President Clinton in his previous years of service where that procedure was followed.
I don't, and maybe Art would know better than me on this, but I don't think that President Clinton used the regular route much throughout his tenure.
Well, Art, what kind of offenses can't be pardoned, if any, besides impeachment?
Basically, yeah, besides impeachment, there are no offenses that cannot be pardoned.
So murder, treason, no matter what the offense is.
That's right, and there has been some contention historically in that regard, but the American experience in the American Constitution is clear. I might just point out, Kent, on the issue of Department of Justice vetting, that despite the fact that this has been fairly well-entrenched recent practice, obviously the Constitution says nothing about this. DOJ vetting is really simply a way for a president, not in a nefarious way, but simply for a president to have some cover. In the case of a controversial pardon, a president might say, well, the Department of Justice has recommended this pardon, and in that sense escape some heat for the choice. But I actually prefer pardon requests not to be vetted through the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice is comprised of fine people, but it's comprised largely of the prosecutors who have already prosecuted these people. So they've already expressed their views in these cases.
So Art, are you suggesting that this be vetted purely through the White House and purely through political processes, or? Yeah,
I would certainly have no problem with vetting exclusively through the White House. I also have no problem with the Department of Justice providing information if it wants to, but the notion that it ought to have two bites of the apple might not be terribly unwise from a policy perspective, although I disagree with it, but it certainly is not commanded by the Constitution.
Well, we need to take a break, but you know, the sheer number of pardons that were granted by President Clinton is something I think we want to address, and exactly who got to be pardoned is certainly something we want to talk about also. We're discussing presidential pardons. What's your verdict?
In a 1940 survey, teachers considered the three worst school problems to be talking in class, tardiness, and chewing gum. In a 1990 survey, the three they picked were drugs, rape, and murder. Now more than ever, kids need self-reliance, a series of courses from Campfire that teach kids the only place to stand is on their own 2 feet. The first fire we light is the fire within. Campfire, boys and girls.
St. Gregory's University has been changing the lives of people like me for 125 years. Affordable, private Catholic education, balanced with dedication to community and service, makes St. Gregory special. We're extremely proud of our students' outstanding academic achievements and our nationally ranked athletic teams. It's when you help a student build a future of balance, integrity, and service that you change a life forever. St. Gregory's, a community for life.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America
and to the republic for which it stands,
one nation under God, indivisible, with
liberty and justice for all.
Every day Americans make this pledge, but few think about its significance. It's our job to make justice a reality by providing legal representation for all citizens. Legal services, keeping the promise of America.
Every day, in state governments throughout the country, crucial decisions are being made that affect the lives of children and their families. But as this process takes place, children are often left voiceless. When these children raise their hands to be heard, is anyone listening? There are people listening. They are child advocates. Join us and raise your hand for kids.
Welcome back to The Verdict. We're discussing presidential pardons. Mick Cornett, along with Kent Myers, Art LeFrancois, and Michael Scaperlanda. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Kent, our old friend Alexander Hamilton checked in on this issue.
Yes, Art suggested he was a classmate of mine. Pretty close. In 1787, we have a graphic of something that Alexander Hamilton wrote in the Federalist number 74. And he wrote, "Humanity and good policy conspire to dictate that the benign prerogative of pardoning should be as little as possible fettered or embarrassed." Art, what do you think about Hamilton's view?
I think Hamilton is expressing the view in this Federalist paper. He actually talks about the issue of pardons in another Federalist paper as well. It seems to me that he's saying that the power ought to be unfettered and it ought to be reposed in one person. And the reason is simply that the power will be used more responsibly because there will be more political accountability to the extent that one person has the responsibility to make the decision.
Michael?
I don't disagree with anything Art said, but I did want to just point out this word embarrassed here, because I think we're here today partly because we've got a president or a former president who was above embarrassing, and he's embarrassed the pardon power by his exercise of it on the last
You know, I'm not a legal scholar like the three of you. However, it seemed to me that that was an extraordinary amount of people to be pardoned, 141.
It is not over an 8-year term. In fact, over an 8-year term, it wouldn't be very significant at all.
You were giving me some other numbers during the break. What were some other examples?
Well, FDR pardoned 2,700 people. Obviously, he had more than 8 years. But President Johnson pardoned about 1,000, and it kind of declined after President Johnson. But 141 at the end of a term, you know, kind of in the last hours before he left office is very unusual.
So maybe people are upset because there were so many at the end, but also who's on the list and what crimes those people were accused of. What was the most outlandish to you?
Well, probably one that has, I think, sunken underneath the radar screen is Roger Clinton.
His brother.
His brother getting pardoned. Henry Cisneros, former mayor of San Antonio, was another one. And then, of course, Mark Rich was the one that received most of the publicity.
Mark Rich's claim to fame is?
He's a fugitive from justice, fled to I guess to Switzerland, I'm not positive, back in the 80s.
What was the reasoning there? What was the reasoning from the White House?
The White House, as far as I know, didn't have a very good reason.
But let's focus on Mark Rich just a minute. Art, is it justifiable at all to pardon the most wanted white-collar criminal fugitive in America on the day you leave office when you've received campaign contributions from people associated with Rich?
Legally, I think it's without question. Yes, it's justifiable, Kent. Is it justifiable morally and politically? That's a question I think the American people will have to answer. But unless there was a quid pro quo, unless there was a pardon that was sold, as happened in Oklahoma, we had a governor who was impeached, I think, in 1923 for having sold pardons. Unless pardons were sold, there simply is no legal issue there.
Well, is there then, unless they're sold, is there no control over pardons at all, Michael?
That's right. Really what the framers intended was to leave the power of pardon completely within the president, and history could judge the president the way it would. And the other control would be impeachment, as happened with the governor of Oklahoma, J.C. Walton.
Well, let's go to pardons for sale a minute. How do you distinguish between somebody making a campaign contribution and then that person or a relative or close associate getting pardoned on the one hand, and just walking in and saying, here's $10,000, I want a pardon? What's the difference between the two?
Well, proving that there was a pardon for sale is very difficult. The paper trail, or I mean, obviously somebody's not going to come in and plunk down money, so proving that there was a quid pro quo is the difficult problem.
And apparently the U.S. attorney in New York City, or the Southern District of New York, is looking at that issue to see if money was paid for pardons.
Mary Jo White is looking at that issue as well as some other issues, I think courtesy of the Attorney General, who has kind of expanded her charge a bit in that regard, but she certainly is studying this one.
Well, let's look at what another graphic tells us. U.S. Representative Barney Frank from Massachusetts has introduced House Joint Resolution 22, and I want to read it. It is proposing a constitutional amendment that says the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States shall not be exercised between October 1 of a year in which a presidential election occurs and January 21st of the following year, except in relation to a death sentence. And all pardons and reprieves must be announced publicly at the time they're granted. Michael, is this a good amendment?
I don't think so. I think the framers had it right when they said that the power rests with the president. It ought to rest with the president. There may be good reasons to grant pardons near the end of his term. I think there are some other measures that could be taken to sort of channel the pardon power back to its original purpose. And I would imagine that even Art would agree with me that maybe the Mark Rich pardon doesn't really fit within the purpose of pardoning.
Well, this is
I would actually disagree.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, if you look, as we do, typically, the notion is that we've kind of, that our pardon power is informed largely from English history, and that English pardon power is informed largely by ancient Roman history. I'm not suggesting that this is a good thing, but history is replete with cases of the pardon power being used, and Mike suggested this earlier, as means to get a political leg up. History is replete with the pardon power being used simply as a way to get money. I don't think that this is a model for how it is that we ought to conduct ourselves, but to the extent that our current situation is informed by history, we're really turning a blind eye toward history if we pretend somehow that the Mark Rich episode is somehow aberrational or at least unique. It certainly is not.
We got to interrupt here. We're running out of time. I want to give both of you a chance to spend 30 or 40 seconds to kind of sum up your opinions on the presidential pardon. Michael, why don't you go first?
Well, I think the pardon power is an important power that the president ought to have. And I think the damage President Clinton has done is brought ill repute and shame on the exercise of this power. And I think, in contrary to what Art would suggest, I think if the Department of Justice process was followed, maybe not with prosecutors, maybe with other personnel, in the Office of Pardon Attorney, we could make good use of the pardon power.
Mm-hmm. Art?
Well, I think, Mick, that it's a good idea to think carefully about the notion of executive clemency generally and why it is that a president might issue a pardon. Do we do this because of mercy? Is this done because of justice? Is it done because the law is somehow imperfect or wrong? And I'm not really sure we have much of a consensus about that, and I'm not sure that we really need one, given the fact that the pardon power really is exclusively the president's. But I think it's a good idea to think carefully about these questions because it tells us a lot about the nature of punishment itself, I think. Secondly, I think Hamilton was exactly right. I think that the only check on allegedly abusive uses of the pardon power ought to be political checks. I think it ought to be simply the political pressure brought to bear by the American people, as we're seeing in the Clinton episode.
Art, Michael, thank you both for being here. Kent and I'll be back with a few final thoughts when we return. You're watching The Verdict with Mick Cornett and Kent Lyons.
In Oklahoma, there are more than 1,600 children waiting to be adopted. They're of all ages, and for many, home has been a source of pain and conflict. They've dreamed of finding a better life and a loving family. Consider adoption. For more information, call 1-877-OK-SWIFT or visit the website www.okdhs.org. Adopt. It may be the toughest job you'll ever love.
Bringing out the best in each student. That is the simple goal and tradition of Heritage Hall. The focus on the individual shapes the educational experience at Heritage Hall. Each student benefits from small classes, able, dedicated teachers, a solid academic curriculum, and exceptional co-curricular programs of athletics, arts, community service, and other activities, parental involvement, personalized counseling, and the development of responsibility, integrity, and love of learning. If you want education taught with pride, then you want Heritage Hall.
Again to our guests, Art LeFrancois and Michael Scaperlanda. Mick Cornett and Kent Myers wrapping it up here. Where are we on this issue of presidential pardons?
Well, it's no less a firestorm now than it was when we started the show a few minutes ago. But it is interesting that that when President Clinton took these actions, the reaction was almost uniformly to denounce it. It ranged from, on the worst, that it is a criminal action that ought to cause the president to be impeached again, if impeachment can happen of a non-sitting president. And at best, it was denounced by members of his own party. Barney Frank had been a consistent defender of Clinton and introduces a constitutional amendment to take some of the power away from the president. It seems to me, for our viewers on the verdict, the question becomes, if we have an unfettered power that can be exercised just any way that the president wants to exercise it, is that something that we ought to retain, or should it be reined in or limited? Or should there be any check or balance on it? Keep in mind, when we come to that conclusion, are we talking about reining in Bill Clinton again? No. We'd be talking about reining in George W. Bush, and that might change your answer. Our experts seem to agree, however, that the pardon power is unfettered and ought to stay that way, but I'm more interested in what the verdict is of our viewers. Should it be unfettered? Should it be limited?
And Americans are always a little bit reluctant to change the Constitution, which is what the amendment would do.
Have to do and be very hard to do.
Yeah, another fascinating topic, Ken. Great job. Again, thanks to Art LeFrancois and Michael Scaperlanda for joining us. For Kent Myers, I'm Mick Cornett. See you next time on The Verdict. This program was brought to you by Crow & Dunlevy, a professional corporation. And also brought to you by a friend of Oklahoma Lawyers for Children and Delta Dental Plan of Oklahoma.